Between Celtic Football Club and the Scottish Government have revealed how the club was told in November that their visit to Dubai was permitted. In one, a Scottish Government official said they were pleased to say that the proposed training camp complied with COVID travel rules governing elite sport. The First Minister Nicola Sturgeon later criticised the club for going ahead with the trip in early January. 16 players and coaching staff had to self-isolate after a positive COVID test.
Executive Peter Lawwell will be retiring at the end of June. It's been quite an era for Lawwell and Celtic. 17 years he's been in that position. Let's get more now from our reporter Charles Patterson. Charles, good to see you this morning. First of all then, is this a surprise? Well, how much of a surprise is this?
I think the timing is perhaps a surprise, John. There have been rumblings in the background for a number of months that perhaps the end of the era might have been nigh, in part due to Celtic's push this season for 10 in a row. There was a feeling that given that Peter Lawwell's been at Celtic since 2003, it might be a fitting time for him to bow out, and it looks very much like Celtic are not going to achieve that 10 in a row. But certainly here in January, they have now identified his successor in Dominic Mackay, who will be moving from Scottish Rugby, and that is the time that he feels Peter Lawwell to announce his departure. There is an ongoing review at the moment at Celtic of all matters on and off the field, and there is much speculation, of course, about the future of Neil Lennon. It could be that we see wholesale change, not just off the field but on the field at Celtic in the summer. But it really does feel like the end of an era. He's been at the club for 17 years, and in that time Celtic have won 13 league titles, and they've won 29 trophies. They've competed in the knockout stages of the Champions League. They've won 4 trebles as well, and they've established themselves as an important club on the European stage. Peter Lawwell's involved with the European Club Association. He's been involved with UEFA committees as well, and he's very highly thought of with the SFA as well. He's involved at the highest levels of Scottish football, and his influence spreads right across the game in this country. So he will be leaving a massive hole when he does leave at the end of June.
So, Charles, no doubt big shoes to fill. Would it be fair to say that the path between Scottish rugby and football, or rugby and football generally, is not a well-trodden one for executives? And so is it quite new territory in a sense in that way? And also, what do we know about Dominic Mackay, who's coming in from the SRU?
Well, Dominic Mackay has been at the SRU since 2008. He was the head of communications and marketing initially, and he has moved on to work under the CEO at the SRU, Mark Dodson, as the Chief Operating Officer. He's got a very sharp corporate brain, and he has actually worked pretty closely with football over the last year because, of course, with the COVID pandemic, the SRU, Scottish football have been working with the Scottish Government in order to enhance return to play protocols. Peter Lawwell and Dominic Mackay will know each other pretty well, having sat around various Zoom meetings, I think, over the last 12 months or so. In Celtic, of course, and the SFA have had relatively close relationships with the SRU in recent years. Celtic played at Murrayfield for a few games in 2014, and the SFA were looking to move to Murrayfield at one point a couple of years ago. So the two men know each other well. He will have big shoes to fill, and it'll be interesting to see what his vision is for Celtic moving forward when he takes over in June.
Great. Charles, thanks very much for that. Now, let's bring you more on the news this morning that Celtic Chief Executive Peter Lawwell will retire at the end of June after spending 17 months as Chief Executive. Andy Walker believes it's the right time for Lawwell to step aside.
I'm slightly surprised at the timing of the announcement from Celtic that Peter Lawwell is leaving at the end of the season. I think he's done a lot of good things for Celtic. I think he's probably stayed a bit too long. I think in recent years it was all about Celtic reaching the 10 in a row landmark, and clearly that has gone wrong this season. Celtic are all about memories that are driven by managers and they're driven by players. And I think off the park you absolutely need good governance, and you need a well-led team. I think Peter Lawwell has led a team very well. But I think he's probably been hurt at the level of criticism that he has received at some point this season. Some of the protests from the supporters have completely overstepped the mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's had a huge influence, over a lot of people here, positive influence, huge influence in a positive way for the club over his 17-year reign. I think he's been brilliant to work for. You've had our fallouts, over the piece, but he's had a huge positive influence on my career and many others, and he's a huge loss. Every decision he made, he thought was best for the club going forward. He was devoted to the club, and I think he'll be a huge miss.
Chief Executive Peter Lawwell is to step down after 17 years at the club. His decision comes after a troubled few months at Celtic Park. Let's speak to our sports news correspondent Chris McLaughlin, who's outside Celtic Park. So a bit of a surprise this. What's behind the move?
Yeah, I think the timing is surprising somewhat, Graham, but I think Peter Lawwell had been thinking about this for some time. He has been at this club in charge, as you say, for 17 years. 29 trophies delivered in that time, including 13 league titles. He's a man who's had huge influence not only over this club here, but all of Scottish football and even beyond. But as you say, it has been a tricky 6 months for the Scottish champions, out early of European football, 23 points currently behind rivals Rangers in the pursuit of the title, and of course that ill-fated winter training trip to Dubai. But still big shoes for the man coming in. That man is Dominic Mackay, coming after 13 years at Scottish rugby. He knows Celtic, he's a fan, he has been around the boardroom here for some time, but it's a club in transition, Celtic, and he knows that he has to hit the ground running because the expectations of the fans here is something that never changes.
OK, Chris McLaughlin.
Rodgers was at Celtic, of course. He won 7 trophies with Laurel at the club and has spoken highly about the job that he's done.
Peter, I was obviously aware when I was there of what the long-term plan would be, and I knew at some point over the next few years that would be the case. I think you only need to look at how Celtic is run as a business, and you look at the figures behind that to see the great job that Peter has done there. He's a huge Celtic supporter himself. He loves the club. He has a real passion for Celtic. So it'll be a sad day for him in the day that he does eventually retire, but he'll always be a Celtic supporter. He's done a fantastic job from the business side, giving great stability there to the club.
Neil Lennon has hailed what he has described as the phenomenal achievements of Peter Lawwell after the Celtic chief executive announced he is to retire after 17 years in the post. Live now to Sheila McLaren, who's at Celtic Park. So, Sheila, is this a surprise?
No, Rahman, not a huge shock, but the timing of the announcement has perhaps been hastened. There's been unparalleled success for Celtic under Peter Lawwell's reign, but this season there have been calls for change, with the team falling 23 points behind rivals Rangers in the quest for a 10th consecutive league title. He's presided over one of the most successful eras in Celtic's history. But today, Peter Lawwell decided the time was right to announce his impending departure. Lawwell said he discussed the possibility of his retirement with Chairman Ian Bankier last year and wanted to ensure an orderly handover to his successor. He admitted there was always going to be a natural period of transition at the end of this season, but was disappointed the campaign has not worked out the way he hoped.
He's been brilliant to work for. You've had our fallouts, over the piece, but he's had a huge positive influence on my career. He knew he had to make decisions that wouldn't be popular, but the overriding sort of theory behind that was the best thing for the club going forward.
He's won trophy after trophy, and he's gave his life to this club the last 20 odd years, and Peter loves this club more than anyone.
Under his tenure, Celtic won 29 trophies, including 13 league titles and an unprecedented 4 successive domestic trebles. He also helped bring in record transfer fees for the club. But there were blots on his copybook, and this season in particular, he's come under increasing criticism from supporters.
We've got to recognise the success that we've had under Peter Lawwell, but we can't ignore the failings. We are so aggrieved at the amount of times we're going into Champions League qualifiers where we've not got the players in place. We're trying to scrape through. And the biggest failing, of course, is the failure to win 10 in a row. Winning a season, a historical season, everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong, and a lot of fans will hold Peter Lawwell responsible for that.
It's not only Celtic where Lawwell's presence has been felt. He's been hugely influential across Scottish football, with spells on the boards of both the SPFL and the SFA.
People say, of course, that Peter ran Scottish football. I think he had a huge impact, a huge influence, but of course he didn't run Scottish football. He can't tell 42 member clubs how to vote on any major issue. But he made Celtic the preeminent club in the country, and they weren't that when he took over. So he can also go with that on his CV.
Lawwell will be replaced by Scottish Rugby's Chief Operating Officer Dominic Mackay, who will leave after 13 years at the governing body. Sheila McLaren.
Celtic Chief Executive Peter Lawwell is to stand down after 17 years at the club. The Scottish champions announced earlier that he would be replaced by Scottish Rugby's Dominic Mackay in the summer. The news comes after a difficult time for the Parkhead club on and off the field. Here's our sports news correspondent, Chris McLaughlin.
From the boardroom for nearly 2 decades, he led Celtic to success. More often than not, the club's season under Peter Lawwell ended like this. In 17 years, he delivered a staggering amount of silverware. As rivals Rangers struggled, Celtic became unstoppable, at times invincible.
Huge loss. Every decision he made, he thought was best for the club going forward. He was devoted to the club, and I think he'll be a huge miss.
Here comes Tony Wood. What a moment for Wood! Yes! He turned around the club's finances thanks to regular Champions League qualification and was in charge for games fans will never forget.
I think you only need to look at how Celtic is run as a business, and you look at the figures behind that to see the great job that Peter has done there.
But he had his critics. Some felt he wielded too much influence in the Scottish game.
I think it'd be fair to say at times we've all felt that. But I think during the time that he's been involved in the Scottish game, he has made a massive contribution.
But lately, the good times have given way to the bad times. Trailing Rangers in the league by 23 points, calls for the manager to go, and the ill-fated winter training trip to Dubai. Peter Lawwell is going, but it's highly unlikely to be in the way he'd hoped.
And Chris, Chris, what do we know about the man who's going to replace Peter Lawwell?
Well, Sally, Dominic Mackay has been at Scottish Rugby for 13 years. He became their Chief Operating Officer in 2015. He's well known within Scottish sporting circles. He's seen as something of a very good operator, a bit of an innovator. He was very much involved in slashing the SRU's debt over the past 5 or 6 years. Also key to the SRU's attempts to make Murrayfield the home of Scottish rugby, Scottish football a few years ago. It's a huge step up, though. He is a Celtic fan. That is helpful for some fans looking on. It is a club in transition, though, isn't it? And of course, with that comes big expectations, something that the outgoing Chief Executive, Peter Lawwell, knows all too well, Sally.